Alrighty. Sorry about the delay. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we got some more Maelstrom by Peter Watts. As ever, because Peter Watts has a selection of covers for the book from various publishers, there's a story attached to this one. I'll give you his direct quote in just a sec once I find the page that I just lost while I was opening my mouth and making mouth noises. There we go. So this one is from the Polish publication of Maelstrom. Does this say? Yes, this is by Julian Wycik, or Wycik, from 2011 publishing date. And Peter Watts says the following: The Polish Maelstrom. While Jensen goes with a consistent close-up face motif, Wycik chooses to regard Lenny from a distance. She'd probably prefer it that way. So previously on, what did we do previously on? Let's see, we got the book started. So Lenny Clark's alive, and she has problems, including but not limited to being hunted by, reasonably, by the corporation, the megacorps that tried to kill her, as well as, oh, I don't know, this little problem of hallucinations. More on that later. We also learned that Ken Lubin is still kicking around. He did not die yet. He is probably going to die, at least according to him. We were also introduced to Achilles or Achille. If somebody can get me hard confirmation of a pronunciation there, I'd appreciate it. I am running on thin evidence and gut that it is actually Achilles as opposed to Achille, despite the fact that he is Quebecois and therefore more likely to have the French or Quebecois pronunciation of Achille. Anyway, I'm going with Achilles because I said so. I've given my reasons. His nickname is Killjoy. It's got to be Achilles, right? Definitely. Um, so we've been introduced to Achilles Desjardins, and he's a lawbreaker with an apostrophe. We're going to learn more about what that means. We're going to learn more about Achilles himself, or Desjardins himself. He is a character. We're going to learn more about the organization he works for, CSIRA, CIRA, or just CIRA, whatever. I'll figure out how to pronounce that as time goes on. Otherwise, yeah, strap in. One of the interesting things that I find about this book, and I guess this is sort of like a spoiler, but it's sort of not, is the role reversal flip that's going to occur uh, over the series of character roles in the narrative. So the previous book, Lenny Clark was our de facto point of view protagonist. Basically, we saw things most of the time more or less from her point of view, and she's leading the way. This book, a bit more of it is going to be from Achilles' perspective, or from Desjardins' perspective, and he's going to become our lead protagonist, sort of. Um, what this means for Lenny Clark is where things get interesting, and you will see where that goes as the book goes along. Spoilers. Alrighty, with that, I guess we'll get cracking. Like the beast from the deep. And we'll get moving. Yes, there we go. Okay, sorry about that minor technical issue. Microphone didn't want to come back on. Okay. Corpse. It was no big deal, of course. Someone died every half second, according to the stats. Some of them had to die on his shift. So what? On any given day, Achilles Desjardins saved 10 people for every one he killed. Anybody who wanted to complain about those kinds of stats could go fuck themselves. Actually, that was pretty much what he wanted to do just then, if only the clientele wasn't so bloody twinsen. Pickering's pile was a cylinder inside a cube, sunk 50 meters into the scoured granite of the Canadian Shield. The cube had been built as a repository for nuclear waste just before the permafrost had started melting. NIMBY and the northward spread of civilization had denied it that destiny. The same factors, however, had made it a profitable site for a subterranean drinkin' drug. The pile had been constructed within a transparent 3-story acrylic tube, suspended in the main chamber. The space beyond had been flooded and stacked with light sticks, mimicking the cobalt glow of spent fuel rods. Iridescent butterflies flittered about, their wings bouncing data back and forth in pinpoint sparkles. Poison arrow frogs clambered wetly in little tanks at each table, tiny glistening jigsaws of emerald and ruby and petroleum black. It was peaceful down there. The pile was an inside-out aquarium, a cool green grotto. Desjardins descended into its depths whenever he needed a lift. Now he sat at the circular bar on the second level and wondered how to avoid sex with the woman at his elbow. He knew the subject was going to come up. Not because he was particularly good-looking, which he wasn't. Not because his last name made people think he was Quebecois, which he had been, once. No, he'd been targeted because he'd admitted to this dark, leggy Rorschach, Gwen, she'd called herself, that he was a lawbreaker, and she thought that was cool. She didn't seem to recognize him from his brief flash of media stardom. That had been nearly 2 years ago, and people these days seemed hard-pressed to remember what they'd had for supper the night before. It didn't matter. Achilles Desjardins had acquired a fan. Not that she was a bad-looking fan, mind you. 30 seconds into their conversation, he'd started wondering what she'd look like bent over the ottoman in his living room. 30 seconds after that, he'd mentally sketched out a pretty good artist's conception. He wanted her, all right. He just didn't want her. Oddly, she was dressed like one of those deep-diving cyborgs out of the Enam pack. The disguise was evocative, if superficial. A black lycra body stocking extending seamlessly from toes to neck to fingertips, decorative accessories representing suit controls and outcroppings of implanted hardware, even an ID patch with the Grid Authority logo beveled onto the shoulder. The eyes didn't quite work, though. Real rifters wore corneal overlays that turned their eyes into blank white balls. Gwen was wearing some sort of gauzy, oversized contacts instead. They masked the irises well enough, but judging by the way she had to keep leaning in to stare at him, they weren't cutting it in the photo amp department. She had great cheekbones, though, a wide mouth, lips so sharply defined you could cut yourself on their edges. Her company in this casual and public venue was all he wanted. Enough time to learn the features, savor the smells, commit her to memory. Maybe even make friends. That would be more than enough. He could fill in the blanks himself later. Fire them, too. "I can't believe how much you have to deal with," she was saying. A wriggling mesh of undersea light played across her face. "The plagues, the blights, the system crashes, all your responsibility." "Not all mine. There's a bunch of us." "Still, life and death decisions, split-second timing." Her hand brushed his forearm, the wing of a black moth. "Lives lost if you make the wrong move." "Or even the right one sometimes." He'd met lots of Gwens before. Like any K-selecting mammalian female, she was attracted to resource holders. Or, more proximately, in the case of genus Homo, power. She probably assumed, because he could shut down a city at will, that he must have some. A common mistake among K-selectors. Desjardins generally took his time about disabusing them. She grabbed a derm from a nearby tray, looked inquiringly at Desjardins. He shook his head. He had to be careful what recreational chemicals he stuck into his body. Too many potential interactions with the professional ones already bubbling away in there. Gwen shrugged, stuck the derm behind her ear. How do you handle the responsibility? She went on. Hell, how do you even get the responsibility? She tossed back her drink. All the corpses and kings and policymakers, they can't even agree what color to paint the bathrooms at the UR. Why'd they all agree to give godlike powers to you, exactly? You infallible or something? Fuck no. Fleeting across his cortex, an unwelcome thought. I wonder how many people I killed today. I do my best. Yeah, but how do you even convince them of that? What's to stop you from crashing an airplane to get back at your boss? How do they know you're not going to use all that power to get rich or to help out your buddies or kill a corporation because you don't agree with its politics? What keeps you in line? Desjardins shook his head. You wouldn't believe it. Bet I can guess. So guess. Guilt trip, right? And absolution? He laughed to cover his surprise. Gwen laughed with him, reached into the nearest terrarium and stroked one of the jeweled frogs inside. They'd been tweaked to secrete mild psychoactives through the skin. Her shoulder was against his by the end of the maneuver. She waved off a couple of butterflies that were sniffing her for signs of actionable impairment. I hate those things. Well, you are mixing your chemicals a bit. Not too good for the ambiance if you throw up all over the bar. Aren't you all law and order? That's a joke, a riff on law and order, spelled Lawnorder. She rubbed thumb against forefinger to grind the frog juice into her skin, not to mention avoiding the subject. Subject? Guilt trip, remember? She leaned in close. I hear things, you hear things. Some sort of retrovirus, right? Forces you to behave yourself right down into the brainstem. She was guessing. She didn't know about the chemistry of guilt. Tell her about the interaction of GSH and synaptic vesicle, and she'd probably give you a blank look. She didn't know about the toxoplasma tweaks or the little ass-backward blobs of reverse transcriptase that got the whole ball rolling. She didn't know, and even if she did, she didn't. You couldn't know about that stuff until you actually felt it in you. Retrovirus was all she knew, and she wasn't even sure about that. Nope, he told her. Wrong. Sorry. He wasn't even lying. The virus was only the carrier. She rolled her eyes. I knew you wouldn't tell me. I knew it. So, why the diver getup? Suddenly, changing the subject seemed like a good idea. Rifter's chic. The corner of her mouth lifted in a half-smile. Solidarity through fashion. What, rifters are political now? She seemed to perk up a bit. You remember, you can't spend all your time saving the world. He didn't. And there had been a bit of a flap a few months before, after some ferret-nosed journalist had managed to sneak the story past the Enum wire censors. Turned out the GA'd been recruiting incest victims and war vets to run their deep-sea geothermal stations. The theory being, those best suited to the chronic stress of that environment were those who'd been, how would the spinners put it, preconditioned since childhood. There'd been the usual squeals of public outrage, everything from, how dare you exploit society's victims for the sake of a few megawatts, to, how dare you turn the power grid over to a bunch of psychos and post-trauma head cases. It had been quite the scandal for a while. But then some new strain of equine encephalitis had spread through the Strip, and someone had traced it to a bad batch of contraceptives in the cyclers. And now, of course, with everybody still reeling after the quake out west, people had pretty much forgotten the Rifters and their problems. At least, he'd thought they had. But now there was this woman at his side, and whatever outlets she took her fashion cues from. "Listen," she said, "I bet you get tired fighting the forces of entropy all the time. Want to take a break and obey the second law of thermodynamics for a change?" "Entropy's not a force. Common misconception." "Stop talking so much. They've got rooms downstairs. I'll pay for the first hour." Desjardins sighed. "What?" Gwen said. "Don't tell me you're not interested. Your vitals have been horning up since the moment I arrived." She tapped one of the accessories on her outfit, a biotelemetry pickup, he noticed belatedly. He shrugged. "True enough." "So, what's the problem? Didn't take your pills today? I'm clean." She showed him the tattoos on her inner wrist. She'd been immunized against an arsenal. "Actually, I just don't get out much." "No shit. Come on." Gwen laid a hand firmly on his arm. "For two reasons," said a female voice at his back. "I'm guessing that Killjoy here is about to turn you down. Don't take it personally." Desjardins briefly closed his eyes. "I thought you didn't indulge." 1.7 meters of skinny, troublemaking Filipino stepped into view. "I'm Alice," she said to Gwen. "Gwen," said Gwen to Alice. "Reason number one," Jovellanos continued, "is that he's just been called in." "You're kidding," Desjardins said. "I just got off." "Sorry. They want you back in. Let's see." Jovellanos glanced at her wrist. 7 minutes now. Some corpse actually flew out from Nampak just to see you in person. You can imagine their frustration when they discovered you'd turned your watch off. "It's past curfew. Just being a good citizen." Which was utter detritus, of course. Lawbreakers were exempt from such restrictions. Sometimes Desjardins didn't want to be found. Obviously a forlorn hope. He pushed himself back from the bar and stood up, spreading his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Sorry, nice meeting you, though." "Reason number two," Gwen said to Jovellanos. "Oh, sorry. Reason number two," Gwen said to Jovellanos, ignoring him. "Oh, right. Killjoy here doesn't fuck real people. Considers it disrespectful." Jovellanos tilted her head in his direction, a fractional bow. "Not that he doesn't have the instincts, of course. Yeah, I bet he's been taking stereos of you since the moment you sat down." Gwen looked an amused challenge at him. Desjardins shrugged. "I'll wipe 'em if you've got any objections. I was going to ask anyway." She shook her head. That enticing half-smile played faintly across her face. "Have fun. Maybe they'll even get you interested in the real thing after a while." "Better hope not," Jovellanos remarked. "You probably wouldn't like what he's into." Alice is righter than she may know. Complex Systems Instability Response Agency. The words hung at the back of the lobby like a glowing uvula, a vain and bureaucratic demand for respect. Nobody ever bothered to speak them aloud, of course. Few even shortened it down to CSIRA, which the corpses would gladly have settled for. Nope. The Entropy Patrol. That was the name that had stuck. You could almost see the space cadet uniforms. Desjardins had always thought that saving the world should engender a bit more respect. What makes you such an enculé today? He grumbled as they stepped into the elevator. Jovellanos blinked. Sorry? That whole scene back there? Don't you believe in truth in advertising? You don't hide any of that stuff. Mostly. You don't hide any of that stuff. Mostly. I like to control the flow rate, though. Jesus. He punched Admin 6. Your timing was shitty. My timing was great. They want you upstairs now, Killjoy. I don't think I've ever seen Lertzman quite so invested in anything before. If I'd waited for you to go through your usual non-mating dance, we'd have been down there till the ice caps refroze. Besides, you've got a real problem saying no. You could have ended up fucking her just to keep from hurting her feelings. I don't think her feelings are all that fragile. So what? Yours are. Oh, wait. So what? Yours are. The doors open. Desjardins stepped through. Jovellanos hung back. He looked at her, a trifle impatiently. I thought we were in a hurry. She shook her head. You are. I'm not cleared for this. They just sent me to get you. What? Just you. That's bullshit, Alice. They're being paranoid about this, Killjoy. I told you. Invested. The doors slid shut. He stuck his finger into the bloodhound, winced at a brief stabbing pain. A physical sample. They weren't even trusting distance spec today. After a moment, an executive summary scrolled down the wall in 3 columns. On the left, a profile. Blood type, pH, gas levels. On the right, an itemized list. Platelets, fibrinogen, RBCs and WBCs, antibodies, hormones. All the parts of his lifeblood that had come from nature. In the center, another list, somewhat shorter. The parts that had come from Xira. That's me pronouncing CSIRA. I'm not going to say CSIRA every time. Xira. Xira. Desjardins had learned to read the numbers, after a fashion. Everything looked in order. Of course, it was nice to have independent confirmation. The door in front of him was opening, and none of the others were slamming shut. He stepped into the boardroom. 3 people were arrayed at the far end of the conference table. Lertzman sat in his usual seat at the head. To his left was a short blonde woman Desjardins hadn't seen before. Which meant nothing, of course. He didn't know most of the people in admin. To the blonde's left, another woman. Desjardins didn't know her either. She looked back at him through eyes that literally glittered. Tactical contacts. She was only partly in the room. The rest of her was watching whatever overlays those lenses served up. At the edges of her mouth and around her mercurial eyes, faint lines and a slight droop to the right eyelid. Otherwise, the face was a pale and featureless sketch, a Caucasian wash. That's, there's an, it's a hybrid word. There's a reason I pronounced it funny. It's C-A-U-C capital A-S-I-A-N. So she's a Caucasian Asian descent. Her dark hair grayed at the temples, a discoloration that seemed to spread infinitesimally as he watched. The corpse from Enampak had to be. Lertzman rose expectantly. The blonde started to follow his lead. Halfway out of her chair, she glanced at Enampak. Enampak did not stand. The blonde hesitated, wavered, sat back down. Lertzman cleared his throat and followed suit, waving Desjardins to a seat opposite the 2 women. This is Patricia Rowan, Lertzman said. When, after a few moments, it became obvious that nobody was going to introduce the blonde, Desjardins said, "Sorry to keep you waiting." "On the contrary," Rowan said softly. She sounded tired. "I'm sorry to drag you back here on your downtime. Unfortunately, I'm only in town for a few hours." She tapped commands into a control pad on the table in front of her. Tiny lights scrolled across her eyes. "So, the famous Achilles Desjardins, savior of the Med." "I just did the stats," he said, "and they only postponed the inevitable for a few months." "Don't sell yourself short," the corpse said. "Mean event resolution 36.8 minutes. That's excellent." Desjardins acknowledged with a nod. "The metabase," Rowan continued. "Plagues, brushfires, traffic flow. And even setting the Mediterranean aside for the moment, I'm told your projections helped a lot in keeping the Gulf Stream going. A few people have you beat in Maelstrom, certainly, but you've got the edge in biocontainment, economics, industrial ecology." Desjardins smiled to himself. Typical old school. She actually thought she was ticking off a list of different subjects. "At any rate," the corpse continued, "you seem to be the best local candidate for what we have in mind. We're taking you off your normal rotation and putting you onto a special project, with Dr. Lertzmann's approval, of course." "I think we could probably spare him," Lertzmann said, embracing the pretense that his opinion mattered. "In fact, after today, I imagine Achilles would probably want to leave Maelstrom behind for a while." Enculé. The sentiment was almost a reflex where Lertzmann was concerned. Rowan again. There's a biological event we'd like you to keep an eye on. New soil microbe, from the looks of it. So far, it's had a relatively minor impact. Almost negligible, in fact, but the potential is, well..." She inclined her head toward the blonde on her right. On cue, that woman tapped her wristwatch. "If you'd open for download." Desjardins tapped the requisite shorthand onto his wrist. Transfer protocols flickered briefly across his field of view. "You can study the stats afterward," the blonde told him. "Briefly, though, you're looking for a small-scale substrate acidification, reductions in chlorophyll A, maybe some changes in xanthophylls." Science. No wonder nobody'd bothered to introduce her. "There might be a reduction in soil moisture levels, too, but we don't know that. Probable decline in Bt and associated microflora. Also, we suspect the spread will be temperature limited. Your job is to develop a diagnostic profile, something we can use to tag this bug from a distance." "That sounds a bit long-term for my skill set," Desjardins remarked. "Not to mention boring as hell. I'm really more optimized for acute crisis work." Rowan ignored the hint. "That's not a problem. We selected you for your pattern recognition skills, not your brushfire reflexes." "Okay, then," he sighed to myself. "What about an actual signature?" "Excuse me?" "If you're talking about depressed chlorophylls, I'm assuming conventional photosynthesizers are being replaced. By what? Any new pigments I should be looking for?" "We don't have a signature yet," the woman told him. "If you can work one up, that'd be great, but we're not hopeful." Is that Rowan or the scientist? Oh, I think that's Rowan. Sorry. "We don't have a signature yet," the woman told him. "If you can work one up, that'd be great, but we're not hopeful." Come on, everything's got a signature. That's... Oh, wait. No, that is the other one. Never mind. Sorry, I was right the first time. My bad. "That's true, but this thing's direct sig may not show up at a distance until it's already at outbreak concentrations. We want to catch it before then. Indirect telltales are probably your best bet." "I'd still like the lab stats. An actual culture, too, of course." He decided to float a trial balloon. "Alice Jovellanos could be helpful in this. Her background's in biochem."
"Alice hasn't had her shots yet," Lertzman began.
Rowan smoothly cut him off. By all means, Dr. Desjardins. Anyone you can think anyone you think could be helpful. Keep in mind, though, the security classifications are subject to change, depending at least partly on your own results, of course. Thanks. And the culture? We'll do what we can. There may be concerns about releasing a live sample, for obvious reasons. Uh-huh. Start your search along coastal Enumpak. We think this bug's limited to the Pacific Northwest, between Vancouver and Coos Bay, most likely. So far, Desjardins added. With your help, Dr. Desjardins, we don't expect that to change. He'd seen it all before. Some farm had lost control of another bug. The quake had cracked open an incubator somewhere, and the competing forces of corporate secrecy and agricultural Armageddon had beat each other senseless in a boardroom somewhere else, and Patricia Rowan, whoever she was working for, had emerged from the wreckage to dump the whole thing into his lap. Without giving him the right tools for the job, Natch. By the time they'd skimmed off all the molecules with patents hanging from them, his culture sample would amount to 20 cc's of distilled water. A sound sneaked out, half laugh, half snort. Excuse me? Rowan arched an eyebrow. You had a comment? A brief, cathartic fantasy. Actually, I have a question, Ms. Rowan. Does all this bullshit turn your crank? Does the senseless withholding of vital information give you some kind of hard-on? It must. I mean, why bother retrofitting me down to the fucking molecules? Why bioengineer me into some paragon of integrity, only to decide I still can't be trusted when the chips are down? You know me, Rowan. I'm incorruptible. I couldn't turn against the greater good if my life depended on it. Into the growing silence, Lurtzman emitted a brief, panicky cough from behind one clenched fist. Sorry, no, nothing really. Desjardins tapped his watch, his hands safely beneath the table. He grabbed at the first heading to come up on his inlays. It's just, a cute name. Behemoth. What's it from? It's biblical, Rowan told him. I never liked it much myself. He didn't need an answer to his unspoken questions anyway. He figured Rowan had a very good reason for playing things so close to her chest. Of course, she knew he couldn't work against the greater good. But she could. Bang! For Lenny Clark, the choice between sharks and humans was not as easy as it might have been. Making it, she paid another price. Making it, she paid another price. She missed the darkness. Night, no matter how moonless and overcast, was no match for eyecaps. There weren't many places on Earth dark enough to blind them. Light-sealed rooms, of course. Deep caves and the deep sea, at least those parts free of bioluminescence. Nowhere else. Her caps doomed her to vision. She could always remove them, of course. Easy enough to do, hardly different from popping out a pair of contact lenses. She vaguely remembered the look of her naked eyes. They were pale blue, so pale the irises almost got lost in the whites. Sort of like looking into sea ice. She'd been told her eyes were cold and sexy. She hadn't taken her caps out for almost a year. She'd kept them on in front of people she'd fought against, fought for, fucked over. She hadn't even taken them off during sex. She wasn't about to strip now, in front of strangers. If it was darkness she was after, she'd have to close her eyes, sorry. Surrounded by a million refugees, that wasn't the easiest thing to do, either. She found a few square meters of emptiness. Refugees huddled under blankets and lean-tos nearby, slept or fucked in darkness that must have afforded some cover to their eyes, at least. They'd pretty much left her alone, as Amitov had said they would. In fact, they accorded her considerably more space than they granted each other. She lay back in her little patch of sand, her territory, and closed her eyes against the brilliant darkness. A soft rain was falling. The dive skin numbed her body to it, but she could feel it on her face. It was almost a caress. She drifted. She imagined she must have slept at some point, but her eyes happened to be open on two occasions, when botflies passed quietly overhead, dark ellipses backlit by a brightness too faint for naked eyes. Each time she tensed, ready to flee into the ocean, but the drones took no notice of her. No initiative, she reflected. They don't see anything they're not programmed to look for. Or perhaps their senses weren't as finely tuned as she'd feared. Or perhaps they just couldn't see any of perhaps they just couldn't see her implants. Maybe her aura was too faint or too far away. Maybe botflies didn't see as deeply into the EM spectrum as she'd feared. I was all alone that first time, she thought. The whole beach was closed off. I bet that's it. They pay attention to trespassers. So did Amitav, evidently. That was shaping up to be a problem. He appeared at the cycler the next morning with a dead botfly in his arms. It looked a bit like a turtle shell she'd once seen in a museum, except for the vents and instruments studding the ventral surface. It was split along its equatorial seam. Black smudge lines whoops. It was split along its equatorial seam. Black smudges lined the breach. Can you fix this? Amitov asked. Any of it? Clark shook her head. Don't know anything about botflies. She lifted the carapace anyway. Inside, burned electronics nested under a layer of soot. She ran one thumb along a small pebbled convexity, felt the compound lenses of a visual cluster beneath the grime. Some of the tech was vaguely familiar, but... No, she said, setting it on the sand. Sorry. Amitov shrugged and sat, cross-legged. I did not expect so, he said, but one can always hope, and you seem to have such familiarity with machines yourself. She smiled faintly, freshly aware of the implants crowding her thorax. I expect you will be going to the fence, Amitov said after a moment. Your people will let you through when they see you are one of them. She looked to the east. Off in the distance, the border towers rose from a fog of human bodies and trampled scrub. She'd heard about the high voltage lines and the razor wire strung between them. She'd heard other things, too, about refugees so driven by their own desperation they'd climbed 7 or 8 meters before the juice and their own cumulative dismemberment had killed them off. Their lacerated remains were left rotting on the wires, the story went. Whether as an act of deterrence or simple neglect was unclear. Clark knew it was all just alligator tales. Nobody over 13 believed such bullshit, and the people here, for all their numbers, didn't seem motivated enough to hold a garage sale, much less storm the battlements. What was the word Amitov had used? Docile. In a way, it was a shame, though. She'd never actually been out to the fences. She'd never actually been to the fences. It might have been interesting to check them out. Being dead had all sorts of little drawbacks. Surely you have a home to go to. Surely you do not wish to stay here, Amitov prodded. No, she said to both questions. He waited. She waited with him. Finally, he stood and glanced down at the dead botfly. I do not know what made this one crash. Usually they work quite well. I believe you've already seen 1 or 2 pass by, yes? Your eyes may be empty, but they are not blind. Clark held his gaze and said nothing. He nudged the little wreck with his toe. These are not blind either, he said, and walked away. It was a hole in darkness, a window to another world. It was set at the height of a child's eyes, and it looked into a kitchen she'd not seen in 20 years. Onto a person she hadn't seen in almost that long. Her father knelt in front of her, folded down from adult height to regard her eye to eye. He had a serious look on his face. He grasped her wrist with one hand, something dangled in the other. She waited for the familiar sickness to rise in her throat, but it didn't come. The vision was a child's, the viewer was an adult, hardened, adapted, accustomed by now to trials that reduced child abuse from nightmare down to trite cliché. She tried to look around. Her field of view refused to change. She could not see her mother. Par for the course. Her father's mouth moved. No words came out. The image was utterly silent, a plague of light with no soundtrack. This is a dream, a boring dream. Time to wake up. She opened her eyes. The dream didn't stop. There was a different world behind it, though, a high-contrast jigsaw of photo-amplified light and shadow. Someone stood before her on the sand, but the face was eclipsed by this vision from her childhood. It floated in front of her, an impossible picture-in-picture. The present glimmered faintly through from behind. She closed her eyes. The present vanished. The past didn't. Oh, go away. I'm done with you. Go away. Her father still held her wrist. At least, he held the wrist of the fragile creature whose eyes she was using. But she felt nothing. And now those eyes focused autonomously on the dangling thing in her father's other hand. Suddenly frightened, she snapped her own eyes back open before she could see what it was. But once again, the image followed her into the real world. Here, before the destitute, numberless hordes of the Strip, her father was holding out a gift for Lenny Clark. Her first wristwatch. Please go away. No, said a voice very close by. I am not. Amitov's voice. Lenny Clark, transfixed, made a small animal noise. Her father was explaining the functions of her new toy. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but it didn't matter. She could see him voice acting the little gadget, as in voice activating. The little gadget, stepping through its net access functions. They'd called it the net back then, she remembered, pointing out the tiny antennae that linked to the iPhones. She shook her head. The image didn't waver. Her father was pulling her forward, extending her arm, carefully looping the watch around her wrist. She knew it wasn't really a gift. It was a down payment. It was a token offered in exchange, some half-assed gesture that was supposed to make up for the things he'd done to her all those years ago, the things he was going to do to her right now, the things... Her father leaned forward and kissed some spot just above the eyes that Lenny Clark couldn't shut. He patted the head that Lenny Clark couldn't feel, and then, smiling, he left her alone. He moved back down the hall, out of the kitchen, leaving her to play. The vision dissipated. The Strip rushed in to fill the hole. Amitov glowered down at her. You are mistaken, he said. I am not your father. She scrambled to her feet. The ground was muddy and saturated, close to the waterline. Halogen light stretched in broken strips from the station up the beach. Bundled, motionless bodies lay scattered on the upper reaches of that slope. None were nearby. It was a dream, another hallucination, nothing real. I am wondering what you are doing here, Amitov said quietly. Amitov's real. Focus. Deal with him. You are not the only person to have washed up afterward, of course, the refugee remarked. They wash up even now, but you are much less dead than the others. You should have seen me before. And it is odd you would come to us like this. All of this was swept clean many days ago. An earthquake on the bottom of the ocean. Yes, far out to sea. And here you are, built for the deep ocean. And now you come ashore and eat as if you have not eaten for days. His smile was a predatory thing. And you do not wish for your people to know that you are here. You will tell me why. Clark leaned forward. Really? Or you'll do what, exactly? I will walk to the fence and tell them. Start walking, Clark said. Amitav stared at her, his anger almost palpable. Go on, she prodded. See if you can find a door or a spare watch. Maybe they've left little suggestion boxes for you to pass notes into, You are quite wrong if you think I could not attract the attention of your people. I don't think you really want to. I think sorry. I don't think you really want to. You've got your own secrets. I am a refugee. We cannot afford secrets. Really? Why are you so skinny, Amitav? His eyes widened. Tapeworm? Eating disorder? She stepped forward. Cycler food not agree with you? I hate you, he hissed. You don't even know me. I know you, he spat. I know your people. I know. You don't know shit. If you did, if you really had such a hard-on for my people, as you call them, you'd be bending over backward to help me. He stared at her, a flicker of uncertainty on his face. She kept her voice low. Suppose you're right, Amitav. Suppose I've come all the way up from the deep sea, the axial volcano, even, if you know where that is. She waited. Go on, he said. Let's also say, hypothetically, that the quake was no accident. Someone set off a nuke and all those shock waves just sort of daisy-chained their way back to the coast. And why would anyone do such a thing? Theirs to know, ours to find out. Amitav was silent. With me so far? Bomb goes off in the deep sea. I come from the deep sea. What does that make me, Amitav? Am I the bad guy here? Did I trip the switch? And if I did, wouldn't I at least have planned a better escape than swimming across 300 kilometers of fucking mud without so much as a fucking sandwich, only to crawl up on your fucking strip after a fucking week and get stuck listening to your fucking whining? Does that make any sense at all? Or, the voice leveling now, coming back under control. Did I just get screwed like everyone else, only I managed to get out alive? That might be enough to inspire a bit of ill will, even in a white enum pack have-it-all bitch like myself, don't you think? And somebody, she promised herself, is going to pay. Amitav said nothing. He watched her with his sunken eyes, his expression gone blank and unfathomable once more. Clark sighed. Do you really want to fuck with me, Amitav? Do you want to fuck with the people who did hit the switch? They don't exactly have a light touch when it comes to cleaning up their messes. Right now, they think I'm dead. Do you want to be around me when they find out I'm not? And what is it about you, Amitav said at last, that makes our lives so unimportant? She'd thought a lot about that. It had led her back to a bright, shining moment of discovery she'd had as a child. She'd been astonished to learn that there was life on the moon. Microscopic life, some kind of bacterium that had hitched a ride with the first unmanned probes. It had survived years of starvation in hard vacuum, frozen, boiled, pelted by an unending sleet of hard radiation. Life, she'd learned, could survive anything. At the time, it had been cause for hope. I think that maybe there's something inside me, she said. She said now, I think... Something brushed against her leg. Her arm lashed out reflexively. her fist clenched around the wrist of a young boy. He'd been going for the gas billy on her calf. Ah, Clark said. Of course. The boy stared back at her, petrified. She turned back to Amitav. The child whimpered and squirmed in her grip. Friend of yours? Little diversionary tactic, perhaps? You don't have the balls to take me on, and none of your grown-up buddies will help out, so you use a fucking child? She yanked on the small arm. The boy yelped. Sleepers stirred in the distance, used to chronic disturbance. None seemed to fully awaken. Why should you care? Amitav hissed. It is not a weapon. You said so yourself. Am I a fool to believe such claims when you come here waving it like an atagan? What is it? A shock prod? I'll show you, she said. She bent, still gripping the child. A depolarizing blade protruded from the tip of her glove like a gray fingernail. At its touch, the sheath on her calf split as if scalpeled. The billy slid easily into her grip, a blunt ebony rod with a fluorescent band at the base of the hand grip. Amitav raised his hands, suddenly placating. There is no need. Ah, but there is. Come in close now. Amitav took a step back. It works on contact, Clark said. Injects compressed gas. Comes in handy down on the rift when the wildlife tries to eat you. She thumbed the safety on the billy, jammed the rod point down into the sand. With a crack like the inside of a thunderclap, the beach exploded. The universe rang like a tuning fork. She lay where the blast had thrown her. Her face stung as though sandblasted. Her eyelids were clenched. It seemed like a very long time before she could open them again. A crater yawned across 3 meters of sand, filling with groundwater. She climbed to her feet. The strip had leapt awake in an instant, fled outward, turned back and congealed into a ring of shocked and frightened faces. Amazingly, she was still holding the billy. She eyed the device with numb incredulity. She'd used it more times than she could count. Whenever one of Channer Vent's monsters had tried to take her apart, she'd parried, jammed the billy home, watched as one more predator bloated and burst at her touch. It had been lethal enough to the fish, but it had never exploded with this kind of force before. Not down on the... Oh, shit. On the rift. It had been calibrated to deliver a lethal charge at the bottom of the ocean, where 5,000 psi was a gentle burp. Down there, it had been a reasonably effective weapon. At sea level, without all those atmospheres pushing back, it was a bomb. I didn't mean... I thought... Clark looked around. An endless line of faces looked back. Amitav lay sprawled on the opposite side of the crater. He moaned, brought one hand to his face. There was no sign of the boy. Stickman. A thunderclap at midnight. Something exploded near a Calvin cycler just south of Gray's Harbor. A botfly had been coming around the headland to the south. It wasn't line of sight at detonation, but it had ears. It sent an alert to home base and turboed over to investigate. Suhan Perot was on duty. She'd swapped over to the graveyard shift the day she'd learned that mermaids came out at night. Her husband, having recently learned about the special needs of VPTS victims, had accepted the change without complaint. Now she slipped into the botfly's perceptual sphere and took stock. VPTS is spelled lowercase v, capital PTS. So I'm fairly confident that stands for virtual post-traumatic stress. I could be wrong about that, but I'm fairly confident. Hoping not to be too far up on that bell curve of Dunning-Kruger with that one. So confident. A shallow crater yawned across the intertidal substrate, tracking outward chaotic tangles of heat and bioelectricity, restless as spooked cattle. Perot narrowed the EM to amped visible. The heat lightning The heat lightning resolved into a milling mass of dull gray humanity. There's an N in lightning. It might just be heat lighting. Resolved into a milling mass of dull gray humanity. The strip had its own districts, its own self-generating ghettos within ghettos. The people here hailed mainly from the Indian subcon. Perot set her primary filters to Punjabi, Bengali, and Urdu. She began asking questions. An explosion. Yes. Nobody really knew for certain what had led up to it. There had been raised voices, some said. Man, woman, child, accusations of theft. And then suddenly, bang! Everyone awake after that, everyone in retreat. The woman waving some kind of shock prod like a club. The masses keeping their distance. One man in the circle with her, blood on his face. Angry. Facing the woman, indifferent to the weapon in her hand. The child had vanished by this time, all agreed. Nobody knew who the child might have been. Everyone remembered the adults, though. Amitav and the mermaid. Where did they go? Perot said. The botfly translated her words with toneless dispassion. To the ocean. The mermaid always goes into the ocean. What about the other one, this Amitav? After her, with her, to the ocean. 10 minutes passed, perhaps. Perot pulled the botfly into a steep climb, panned along the strip from 50 meters up. The refugees dissolved into a Brownian horde. Waves of motion passed through the crowd far faster than any one person could make way. There, barely discernible, a fading line of turbulence connecting the crater to the surf. Milling particles recently disrupted by the passage of something aimed. She swooped down toward the waterline. Upturned faces everywhere, gray and luminous in the botfly's photoamps, following its course like sunflowers tracking the light. Except for one, a ways down the beach, running south through ankle-deep foam. Not looking back. Perot widened the filters. Nothing mechanical in the thorax. Not the mermaid. There were other anomalies, though. She was chasing a skeleton, a ludicrous, emaciated throwback to the days when malnutrition was a recognized hallmark of refugees everywhere. There was no need for starvation here. There'd been no need for years. This one had chosen to starve. This one was political. No wonder he was running. Perot nudged the botfly into pursuit. It sped past its quarry in seconds, slewed around, and dropped down to block his escape. Perot tripped the floods and pinned the refugee in twin beams of blinding halogen. Amitav, she said. She'd heard them, of course. They were... Whoops. One sec. Lost the page flipping to the next page. My bad. She'd heard of them, of course. They were rare, but not too rare for a label. Stickmen, they were called. Perot had never actually seen one in the flesh before. Hindian. Sunken eyes, pools of sullen shadow. Blood oozing in a sheen of droplets from his face. One hand was raised, to shield his eyes from the light. More blood rose from a raw stigmatum on the palm. Limbs, joints, fingers as sharp-edged and angular as an as origami, protruding from his torn clothing. The soles of his feet had been sprayed with plastic in lieu of shoes. The ocean hemmed him in on one side. Strippers looked on curiously from all others, keeping clear of the halogen pool. Every segment of the stickman's frame was tensed, poised between equally futile options of flight and attack. "Relax," Perrault said. "I only want to ask you some questions."
Ah, questions from a police robot, he said.
Thin lips drawn back from brown teeth, the cracks between bloody. A cynical rictus.
I am relieved.
She blinked. "You speak English?"
It is not an uncommon language. Not as stylish as French these days, though, yes. What do you want?
Perrault disabled the translator. "What happened back there?"
There is no cause to worry. None of your machinery was harmed.
"I'm not interested in the machinery. There was an explosion."
Your wonderful machines do not provide us with explosives, Amitov pointed out.
"There was a woman, a diver. There was a child." The stickman glowered. "I just want to know what happened," Perrault told him. "I'm not looking to give you any trouble." Amitov spat.
Of course not. You blind me to test my eyes. Yes.
Perrault killed the floods. Black and white faded to gray.
Thank you,
Amitov said after a moment. "Tell me what happened."
She said it was an accident, Amitov said.
"An accident?"
The child was... Clark had this, I am not sure of the word, this club on her leg. She called it a billy.
"Clark?"
Your diver.
"Clark. Do you know her first name?"
No, Amitov snorted. Kali is as good a name as any, though.
"Go on."
The child, he tried to steal it while we were talking.
"You didn't stop him?"
Amitov shifted uncomfortably. I believe she was trying to show the child that the billy was dangerous, he said. In that she succeeded. I myself flew. It left marks. I myself flew. It left marks.
He smiled, held up his hands once more, palms up, flayed flesh oozing blood. Amitov fell silent and looked out to sea. Perrault's perspective bobbed slightly in a sudden breeze, as though the botfly was nodding.
I do not know what happened to the child, Amitov said at last. By the time I could stand again, he was gone. Clark was looking for him, though.
"Who is she?" Perrault asked softly. "Do you know her?" He spat.
She would not say so.
"But you've seen her before. Tonight was not the first time."
Oh, yes, your pets here, looking at the other refugees. They come to me whenever something requires initiative, yes? They tell me where the mermaid is so I can go and deal with her.
"But you two are connected somehow. You're friends, or—"
Page transition, my bad. We are not sheep, Amitov said. That is all we have in common. Here, it is enough.
"I want to know about her."
That is wise, Amitov said more quietly.
"Why do you say that? Why do you say that?"
Because she survived what you did to her. Because she knows you did it.
"I didn't do anything." The stickman waved one dismissive hand.
No matter, she will come for you anyway.
"What happened? What was done to her?"
She did not say exactly. She says very little. And sometimes when she does say things, she does not say them to anyone here, yes? At least no one I can see. But they get her quite upset.
"She sees ghosts?"
Amitov shrugged. Ghosts are not uncommon here. I am speaking to one now.
"You know I'm no ghost."
Not a real one, perhaps. You only haunt machinery.
Suhan Perrault looked for a filter to tweak. She couldn't find one that fit.
She says you caused the earthquake. Amitav said suddenly. She says you sent the wave that killed so many of us.
That's ridiculous.
And you would know, yes? Your leaders would share such things with the drivers of mechanical insects?
Why would anyone do something like that?
Amitav shrugged. Ask Clark, if you could find her.
Can you help me do that?
Certainly. He pointed to the Pacific. She is out there.
Will you see her again?
I do not know.
Can you let me know if you do?
And how would I do that, even if I wished to?
Suhan, Perot said.
I do not understand.
That's my name, Suhan. I can program the botflies to recognize your voice. If they hear you calling me, they'll let me know.
Ah, Amitav said.
Well?
Amitav smiled. Don't call us. We'll call you.
Ah, thanks for tuning in, Optical Antenna. You were stuck in a dream. Well, good morning to you too. Hopefully, you escaped the dream, unless this is but a manifestation of said dream. How would you ever know? Good question.
Sufficiently advanced simulation would be indistinguishable from the real thing, provided the proper calibration of electrodes to brain regions. I don't think the subsonic wave thing or whatever Musk keeps claiming he's working on for brain add-ons as an interface would be especially viable in that regard, but I don't know.
An invitation to dance. In South Bend, the mermaid killed a man. Willapa Bay ruptured the strip like an ulcer 12 kilometers across. Official surveillance of that gap had not been designed to catch people for whom breathing was optional. Now the coast was 15 clicks behind her. This far in, the wave had been thwarted by headlands and a thick stubby island, clogging the inlet like a cyst. The big one had merely trembled here. The wreckage and desolation was all of local origin. She emerged past midnight onto a dark, corroded segment of waterfront, long since abandoned to a creeping blight of pre-millennial toluene. Nervous late-night pedestrians glimpsed her on the edge of the city core and increased their pace from A to B. The last time Clark had wandered civilized streets, there'd been free wristwatch dispensers on every second corner, a half-hearted sop to those who'd have empowered the masses through access to information. She could find no dispensers in this place, only an old public phone standing guard in fluorescent twilight. She interrogated it. She was here, it told her. Eve Scanlon lived there, 300 kilometers to the northeast. He wouldn't be expecting her. She faded to black. Indifferent security cameras reduced her to a transient assemblage of infrared pixels. She clambered back down concrete scree to an oily waterline. Something called to her as she retrieved her fins. Muffled, familiar sounds from an abandoned customs office. It could have been the splintering of rotten pilings. Maybe a boot against the ribs, with flesh getting in the way. Something knotted in Clark's throat. There's no end to the things you can slam into a human body. She'd lost count of the different sounds they made. Almost too faint to hear, more whimper than words. Fuck, man! The muted hum of an electrical discharge. A groan. A walkway extended around the derelict office. Junk piled along its length waited to trip anyone not gifted with night eyes. At the other side of the building, a dock jutted from the waterfront on wooden pilings. Two figures stood on that platform, a man and a woman. Four others lay twitching at their feet.
A police botfly slept on the pier, conveniently offline. Technically, of course, it was not an assault. Both aggressors wore uniforms and badges conferring the legal right to beat whomever they chose. Tonight, they'd chosen an entree of juveniles, laid out along the creosote-stained planks like gutted fish. Those bodies twitched with the spastic neural static of shock prod discharge. Beyond that, they didn't react to the boots in their sides. Clark could hear snatches of conversation from the uniforms, talk of curfew violations and unauthorized use of the Maelstrom, and of trespassing. "On government property, no less," remarked the male, lifting one arm in a grand gesture that took in the dock, the pilings, the derelict office. Lenny Clark. Shit, he's wearing nightshades. They're both wearing nightshades. You! The policeman took a single step toward the office, pointing his shock prod at the shadows in which she lay exposed. Stand away from the building! There'd been a time, not so long ago, when Lenny Clark would have obeyed without thinking. She'd have followed orders even though she knew what was coming, because she'd learned that you deal with violence by just shutting up and getting it over with. It would hurt, of course. That was the whole point. But it was better than the chronic queasiness, the expectation, the endless interludes between assaults where you could only wait for it to happen. More recently, she would have simply fled, or at least withdrawn. None of my business, she'd have told herself, and departed before anyone even knew she was there. She had done that when Mike Brander had used Jerry Fisher as a convenient proxy for those who'd made his childhood a living hell. It had been none of my business when BB Station resounded with the sound of Brander's rage and Fisher's breaking bones. It had been none of my business when Brander, shift after shift, had stood guard in the wet room, daring Fisher to come back inside. Eventually, Fisher had faded from man to child to reptile, an empty, inhuman cipher living on the edge of the rift. Even then, it had been none of Lenny Clark's business. But Jerry Fisher was dead now. So was Lenny Clark, for that matter. She'd died with the others. Alice and Mike and Ken and Jerry all turned into white-hot vapor. They were all dead, and when the stone had been rolled away and the voice had rung out, "Lazarus, come forth!" it hadn't been any of Lenny Clark's friends that had risen from the grave. It hadn't even been Lenny Clark. Not the soft, squirming career victim of her dryback days, anyway. Not the opaque chrysalis gestating down on the rift. It had been something newly forged, acid-washed, some white-hot metamorph of Lenny Clark that had never existed before. Now she was confronted by a familiar icon, an authority, a giver of orders, an eager practitioner of the legal right to commit violence upon her. She did not regard its challenge as an order to be obeyed. She did not consider it a situation to be avoided. For Lenny Clark Mark II, it was a long overdue invitation to dance. Pixel Pal. BCC 5932 trigger stimulus slash throughput intercept. Object class file packet slash benign. Object species personal communication. NI packet 7 of 23 slash voice modem. Decrypt.
Object source, corrupted. Object destination, multi, ref CC. Excise criterion, 255 character bracket INI/FIN. Triggering stimuli. Excerpt begins.
They're likely to get away with it forever. A little too metallic, if you know what I mean. Anyway, they haven't caught us at it yet. We did get caught a few days back, though, over something else again. Except we looked into this avenging angel. No shit. Lenny Clark, her name was. It was our own stupid fault, I guess. Didn't check for leakage when we logged on. Anyhow, Le Bourg came down on us. They got everyone except Hadge and me.
Hadge, spelling conjectural.
And what could we do except run for it? And they had everyone down, and all of a sudden there's this K selector walking out of nowhere. Looks like one of those old lit crits with the teeth, you know? Vampires. All in black, and she's wearing the absolute thickest contacts you ever saw, even thicker than lead blue. Barely see her eyes behind them. Anyhow, she just walks out of the shadows and right into them. You wouldn't think she'd last 2 seconds. I mean, she didn't even notice the shock prods. I don't think that suit of hers carries a charge, but still. She just wasn't that big, you know? And they were really wailing on her, and she just took it. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Or like, you know, almost like she got off on it or something. Anyway, she wraps her arms around this big, beefy antibody, and she just pushes, and they go right over the edge. And the sterilites go on when they hit the water. Kind of wild those things still work. Peter hasn't seen any boat traffic in years. And the water lights up all cool and radium glow, and there's some splashing, and then there's this big whoomph. And it's like this huge bubble of blood and guts just sort of boils up to the surface, and the water's like completely gone to rust. She's like some kind of amphibian, one of those rifter cyborgs. We met up with her after. She came back to pick up her fins when things had cooled down. Don't ask me what she was doing here in the middle of the night. Didn't talk much, and we didn't push. We set her up with some snacks and supplies. She'd been eating from cyclers on the strip, if you can believe it. Although it didn't seem to have dulled her edge any. Gave her my watch. She hadn't even heard about the curfew. I had to show her how to get around the time lock. Guess you lose touch with things when you spend all your time on the bottom of the ocean. Not that it held her back any. You should have seen that asshole. They fished him out of the water like an old rag. I would have paid to see his face, you know? I tried to look her up, but Lenny Clark isn't exactly sockeye on the registry. Got more hits than holocausts. She did mention her hometown, I think, but I couldn't find that either. Any of you guys ever hear of a place called BB? Anyhow, far as I know, she's still at large. Les Beurs are probably looking for her, but I bet 50 Q-bucks they don't even know what she looks like under all that gear, never mind who she is. I mean, they hardly ever catch us, and they know everything there is to know about us. Well, not everything. Right,
Excerpt ends. Call. Behemoth. Lenny Clark/BB. Confirmed. Add search terms. Amphibians. Refters. Cyborg. There's a slash before every S there. Overlay template. Resequence text. Copy. Translocate. Spread the word. Third person limited. Perot hadn't needed Amitov's permission, of course. She'd programmed the botflies to recognize him anyway. She'd dropped a cloud of mosquitoes, too, little flying sensors no bigger than rice grains. They were brain dead, but they could afford to be. They relayed raw telemetry back to the flies for all the real analysis. That increased coverage by an order of magnitude, at least until their batteries gave out. It would still be a crapshoot. A botfly or skeet would have to be line of sight with Amitov once she'd put out the call, and there'd have to be enough of him visible to make an ID. Very iffy, given the human congestion on the strip. It would be easy enough for the stickman to hide, should he choose to. Still, long odds were better than none. She finished a late supper across the table from her husband, noted his forlorn scrutiny almost in passing. Marty was doing his utmost, she knew, giving space, giving support, waiting for that predictable moment when the shock wore off, her defenses fell, and she needed help picking up the pieces. Every now and then, Perot would search herself for signs of that imminent breakdown. Nothing. The antidepressants were still having some effect, of course, even after her system had shocked itself into partial immunity. But that shouldn't have been enough. She should be feeling something by now. She was. Intense, passionate, all-consuming. Curiosity. She squeezed Martin's hand across the table and headed toward her office. It was almost a half hour until her shift began, but nobody on the circuit minded if she started early. She slid into her seat, a favorite antique with flared arms and a skin of real leather, and was reaching for her headset when her husband's hand fell lightly onto her shoulder. "Why does she matter so much?" he asked. It was the first time he'd come into her office since the breakdown. "Marty, I've got to go to work." He waited. She sighed and swiveled her chair to face him. "I don't know. It's a mystery, I guess. Something to solve." "It's more than that." "Why? Why does it have to be?" She heard the exasperation in her own voice, saw its effect on her husband. She took a breath and tried again. "I don't know. It's just, you wouldn't think a single person could count for much, but she's making an impression, you know? At least on the strip. She matters somehow." Martin shook his head. "Is that what she is to you? A role model?" "I didn't say—" "She could be something else, Sue. What if she's a fugitive?" "What?" "It must have crossed your mind. Someone from Enum. Or, I don't know, not your standard refugee, anyway. Why's she staying out on the strip? Why doesn't she want to go home? What's she hiding from?" "I don't know. That's what makes it a mystery." "She could be dangerous." "What, to me? She's way out on the coast. She doesn't even know I exist."
"Still, you should report it."
"Maybe." Perot swiveled deliberately back to her desk. "I really have to work now, Martin." He wouldn't have let her off so easily before, of course. But he knew his assigned role. He'd been coached by a half-dozen well-meaning authorities.
"Your wife has just come through a very traumatic experience. She's fragile. Let her move at her own pace. Don't push." So he didn't. A little piece of Sue Hone felt guilty for taking advantage of that restraint. The rest was reveling in the cradling embrace of the headset around her skull, the sudden pinpoint control over what was and wasn't perceived, the semen-sucking savior, she whispered. The alert was flashing all over the left side of her visual field. One of the botflies had gotten a nibble. More than a nibble. A big, predatory bite. It was hovering less than 3 meters off target. Not Amitov either this time. A marriage of flesh and machinery. One woman with clockwork. Deep night beneath an endless cloud bank. Across the black water, floodlights and heaters smudged distant light along the strip. Perot triggered the photo amps. The mermaid crouched directly ahead on the jagged reef. Let's try that sentence again. The mermaid crouched directly ahead on a jagged reef, 150 meters from shore. The ocean, sparkling with microbial phosphorescence, tried to dislodge her. Between waves, the reef jutted a meter above the waterline, myriad tiny waterfalls draining down its sides. When the water crested, the mermaid became a round black boulder herself, barely visible in the luminous foam. She climbed to her feet. The surge rose above her knees. She staggered, but stayed upright. Her face was a pale oval painted onto a black body. Her eyes were paler ovals painted onto her face. They panned past the hovering botfly. They did not seem to notice it. Her face tilted down, stared directly ahead. One slick ebony arm reached forward, the fingers extended. A blind woman reaching for something she couldn't see. Clark's mouth moved. Any words were lost in the roar of the surf. Perot slid filters past critical thresholds. Ocean sounds squelched into silence. Now only the shriek of distant gulls and a few syllables. No, not again. Perot squelched the high frequencies as well. Now the mermaid stood in an utterly silent tableau, the Pacific crashing soundlessly on all sides. You never did, she said. Tide surged silently between her legs. The mermaid's reaching fingers closed around empty space. She seemed surprised. Another wave swept the reef. The mermaid staggered, recovered. Perot noticed that both of her hands were balled into fists. Dead. Almost a whisper. Miss Clark, Perot said. The mermaid did not respond. Right, the surf. Perot increased the volume, tried again. Miss Clark. The mermaid's head jerked up. You! What is it? Miss Clark, I've been... Something in the food? Some sort of psychoactive? Is that what this is? Miss Clark, I don't know what... The mermaid smiled, a hideous baring of teeth beneath cold white eye spots. Fine, I can take it. Do your worst. Miss Clark, this is fucking nothing. You just wait. The Pacific surged silently up from behind her, swept her from the reef in the blink of an eye. The cameras caught a last freeze-framed moment. A fist raised briefly above the boiling water. Gone. This is fucking nothing. You just wait. Suhan Perot didn't know that she could. Remora. The lock groaned open like the gates of an iron cathedral. Earthquakes lived in that sound, twisting metal, skyscrapers torqued painfully on their axes. Slow surge pushed flotsam from great doors that stirred the ocean. Rising within that sound, another one, triple screws, cavitating. She'd placed herself a few hundred meters offshore, in the center of a dredged scar leading to deep water. Gray's Harbor's commercial traffic passed directly overhead. By now, she'd had enough practice to make it work. She rose a few meters off the bottom. The drag from the new backpack slowed her a bit, but she was getting used to it. Echo-sounding pulses. Echo-sounding pulse. Echo-sounding. Echo-sounding pulses from the approaching vessel tapped against her implants. The murky water went suddenly, ominously dark, first to her right, then directly overhead. The water pushed her backward. An instant later, a black wall, studded with rivets, rushed obliquely out of the murk and streamed past, filling the ocean. The hiss of approaching screws filled the water. She counted herself lucky, so far, that none of the ships had smashed into her. She knew those odds were low,
Bow waves pushed water and flotsam aside, but such reassuring insights always occurred during quiet moments on the bottom. But such reassuring insights always occurred during quiet moments on the bottom. Now, with a cliff of motion-blurred metal within touching distance, she could only think of fly swatters. She broke the surface. The cliff shimmered into sudden sharp focus, black and rusty red, a great concave overhang eclipsing 3/4 of the sky. An ice wrangler. She turned to face the approaching stern. Racing toward her, edge on, a metal fin angled down and out from the hull just above the waterline. Foam boiled where its distal end cut the water. A trim tab. It could give her a free ride, or take off her head. If she floated along the surface, just past the point where the metal slashed at the sea, the tip of the fin would pass beneath her. There'd be a split second to grab at the leading edge. Maybe 10 seconds to get into position. She almost made it. Her right hand hooked the fin. The left slid off, confounded by turbulence. In an instant the tab was past, taking Clark's hand with it. Everything went bowstring taut in an instant. Her right shoulder popped from its socket. Clark tried to scream. Her flooded amphibian body drowned the sound at conception. She drew her left arm forward. Drag slapped it back. She tried again. The muscles of her right shoulder screamed in outrage. Her left hand crept upstream along the surface of the tab. Finally its fingers found the leading edge, hooked reflexively. Her shoulder popped back into place. Those muscles, never satisfied, screamed all over again. A cascade of water and foam tried to push her off. The Wrangler was moving dead slow, and she was barely hanging on. They'd be opening the throttle the moment they passed the last channel marker. She edged laterally up the slope. Seawater thinned to spray. Then she was clear, lying against the main hull. She split her face seal, her lung reinflated with a tired sigh. The tab angled down at about 20 degrees. Clark propped her back against the hull and brought her knees up, planting her feet downslope. She was wedged securely a good 2 meters from the water. The soles of her fins provided more than enough traction to keep her from slipping. Yeah. Lips decided not to make full contact there. The outermost channel spar slid past. The vessel began picking up speed. Clark kept one eye on the shore, the other on her nav panel. It didn't take long for the readings to change. At last, this one was turning north. She relaxed. The strip scrolled slowly past in the distance, backed by the vertebral spikes of its eastern towers. At this range she could barely make out movement on shore, diffuse patches in vague motion at best. Clouds of flightless gnats. She thought of Amitav, the anorexic, the only one with the balls to come right out and openly hate her. She wished him well. Firebug. Achilles Desjardins had always found smart gels a bit creepy. People thought of them as brains in boxes, but they weren't. They didn't have the parts. Forget about the neocortex or the cerebellum. These things had nothing. No hypothalamus, no pineal gland, no sheathing of mammal over reptile over fish. No instincts, no desires. Just a porridge of cultured neurons, really. 4-digit IQs that didn't give a rat's ass whether they even lived or died. Somehow they learned through operant conditioning, although they lacked the capacity either to enjoy reward or suffer punishment. Their pathways formed and dissolved with all the colorless indifference of water shaping a river delta. But Desjardins had to admit they had their uses.
Wildlife didn't stand a chance going up against a head cheese. Not that wildlife hadn't tried, of course, but the Maelstrom ecosystems had evolved in a world of silicon and arsenide, a few hundred basic operating systems endlessly repeated, predictable registers and addresses, stuff you could count on, not some slab of thinking meat in constant flux. Even if some shark did manage to scope out that architecture, it would be no further ahead. Gels rewired themselves with each passing thought. What good is a map when the landscape won't stop moving? That was the theory, anyway. The proof was an eye of calm, starting out from the heart of Maelstrom itself. Since the day of its birth, the gels had kept it clean, a high-speed computational landscape unpolluted by worms or viruses or digital predators. One day, a long time ago, the whole network had been this clean. Perhaps one day it would be again, if the gels lived up to their potential. For the time being, though, only a select 2 or 3 million souls were allowed inside. It was called Haven, and Achilles Desjardins practically lived there. Now he was spinning a web across one pristine corner of his playground. Rowan's biochemical stats had already been sent to Jovellanos' station. The first thing he did was establish an update link. Then he looked over the ramparts, peeking past the shoulders of the vigilant gels into Maelstrom proper. There were things out there that had to be brought inside. Carefully, though, mindful of the sparkling floors. Tap into EOS archives. Get daily radar maps of soil moisture for the past year, if available. A big if these days. Desjardins had tried to load a copy of Bonnie Ann from the library the week before, only to find they'd started wiping all books that hadn't been accessed for more than a 2-month period. Same old mantra. Storage limitations. EM snaps of polyelectrolytes and complexing cations. I'm not actually sure what a cation is. Multispectrals on all major chlorophylls, xanthophylls, carotenoids, iron and soil nitrogen too. And, just to be thorough, without much hope, mind you, query the NCBI database for recent constructs with real-world viability. Competing with conventional primary producers, Rowan had said, meaning the conventional bugs might be dying off. Do a spectral for elevated soil methane. Distribution potentially temperature limited. Infrared crossed with an albedo and wind speed. Restrict all searches to a polygon extending from the spine of the Cascades out to the coast, and from Cape Flattery down to the 38th parallel. Draw the threads together. Squeeze the signal through the usual statistical gauntlet. Path analysis, Boltzmann transforms, half a dozen breeds of nonlinear estimation. Discriminant functions, Hankins filters, principal component analysis, interferometry profiles across a range of wavelengths, Lin-Hardy hyperniche tables. Repeat all analyses with oh my god, long word hard. Long word split between lines hard. Repeat all analyses with intervariable time lags in sequence from 0 days to 30. Desjardins played at his panel. Abstract shapes condensed from clouds of data, winked provocatively at the corner of his eye, vanished the moment he focused on them. Fuzzy white lines from a dozen directions interwove, colored, took on intricate fractal patterns. But no, this mosaic had a p-value greater than 0.25. That one violated assumptions of I have no idea what that word is. Homoscedasticity. 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 I have no clue what that is. I've read the word at least 3 times before now, and I don't know what it is.
Quick break. We're looking up the definition of the word homoscedasticity because I don't know. Education time, folks. Let's see what Dr. Google says against all better judgment. Homoscedasticity. Oh, it's right there. Homoscedasticity, or homogeneity of variances, is an assumption of equal or similar variances in different groups being compared. This is an important assumption of parametric statistical tests because they are sensitive to any dissimilarities. Uneven variances in samples result in biased and skewed test results. So basically, it's winnowing out outliers, if I'm translating that mentally properly. And I think I might be. Dunning-Kruger possibly kicking in again there, but we'll just live with it for now. The little one in the corner drove the Hessians fucking crazy. One flawed thread, barely visible, and the whole carpet unraveled. Tear it down, bleach out the transforms, start from scratch. Wait a minute. Correlation coefficient of minus 0.873. What was that all about? Temperature. Temperature went up when chlorophyll went down. Why the hell didn't I see that before? Oh, there, a time lag. What the? What the? A soft chime in his ear. Hey, Killjoy, I've got something really strange here. Me too, Desjardins replied. Jovellanos' office was just down the hall. It still took a few minutes. Jovellanos' office was. I am reading 3 lines at once. Give me a minute. I'm having a moment. I'm having a moment. Ah, Jovellanos' office was just down the hall. It still took her a few minutes to show up at his door. The caffeine spike in her hand told him why. You should get more sleep, he remarked. You won't need so many chemicals. She raised an eyebrow. This from the man with half his bloodstream registered in the patent office. Jovellanos hadn't had her shots yet. She didn't need them in her current position, but she was too good at her job to stay where she was much longer. Desjardins looked forward to the day when her righteous stance on the sanctity of free will went head to head against the legal prerequisites for promotion. She'd probably take one look at the list of perks and the new salary and cave. He had, anyway. He spun his chair back to the console and brought the correlation matrix up on the display. Look at this. Chloros go down, soil temperature goes up. Huge p-value, Jovellanos said. Small sample size. That's not the point. Look at the time lag. She leaned forward. Those are awfully big confidence limits. The lag's not consistent. Sometimes it takes a couple of days for the temp to rise, sometimes a few weeks. That's barely even a pattern, Killjoy. Anything. Take a guess at the magnitude, he broke in. Loss of plant cover, right? Jovellanos shrugged. Assuming it is a real effect, say half a degree, quarter? Desjardins showed her. Holy shit, she said. This bug starts fires? Something does, anyway. I scanned the municipal archives along the coast. All local firestorms mostly attributed to acts of terrorism or industrial accidents. Also, a couple of tree farms going down for some agro pest. Budworm or something. Budworm or something. Jovellanos was at his elbow, her hands running over his console. What about other fires in the area? Oh, lots. Even keeping strictly within the search window, I found a good 8 or 9 that didn't correlate. A ties to B, but not vice versa. So maybe it's a fluke, she said hopefully. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Or maybe somebody else has a better track on this bug than we do. Jovellanos didn't answer for a moment. Then, well, we might just be able to improve our own track a bit. Desjardins glanced up. Yeah? I've been working up that sample they gave us. They're not making it easy. They haven't left a single intact organelle as far as I can tell. He waved her on. It all looks the same to a mass spec. Only if they left all the pieces behind after they mashed them. Of course they did. Otherwise, you'd never get an accurate seg. Well, I can't find half the stuff that's supposed to be there. No phospholipids, even. Lots of nucleotides, but I can't get them to fit a DNA template. So your bug's probably RNA based. Uh huh. No surprises there. Lots of microbes got along just fine without DNA. Also, I've managed to reconstruct some simple enzymes, but they're a bit too stiff in the joints to work properly, you know? Oh, and this is kind of weird. I found a couple of D aminos. Ah, Desjardins nodded sagely. That means what exactly? Right-handed. The asymmetric carbons stick off the wrong side of the molecule, like your usual left-handed amino, only flipped. A mirror image. So? So that makes them useless. All metabolic pathways have been geared for L-aminos and only L-aminos for the past 3 billion years at least. There's a couple of bacteria that use R-aminos because they're useless. They stick them onto their cell walls to make them indigestible, but that's not what we're dealing with here. Desjardins pushed back in his chair. So someone built this thing completely from scratch. Is that what you're saying? We've got another new bug on our hands. Jovellanos shook her head, disgusted. And that corpse didn't even tell you. Maybe she doesn't know. Jovellanos pointed at the GIS overlay. 24 crimson pinpoints sparkled along the coast, from Vancouver to Newport. 24 tiny anomalies of soil and water chemistry. 24 visitations from an unknown microbe, each presaging a small, fiery apocalypse. Somebody knows, Jovellanos said. And with that, I'm going to, call it. We will continue next week. We're, like a better part of a quarter way through the book. That's not too bad. So 8 sittings if we continue at this pace, give or take. Cool. Take that win. Alrighty. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. To everybody who tuned in. If you didn't tune in and you're watching this after the fact, I do these live. Starting at noon Eastern Standard Time-ish. Noon-ish Eastern Standard Time on Fridays. Free read Fridays, where we read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. Uh, this week we did our continuation of Maelstrom by Peter Watts, or here as Wir. Wir? I don't know how that's pronounced in Polish, but that's the Polish cover. So this one's a bit meatier than Starfish was. Behemoth winds up being meatier still, but it's split into 2 volumes, um, so it's not going to be as bad per session or per string. It'll only be like, I don't know, 6 tops. I don't see it being much more than that, especially if we do it at the speed that we're doing this. Things are gonna change. But yeah, so hopefully people dig it. I know for sure that I for sure am, because it's a cool book. It is dark. The real nastiness hasn't kicked in. It's very personal nastiness, and it's also very impersonal nastiness later. These will become clear things when they occur. Other than that, hopefully people have as nice a day as they possibly can, given whatever circumstances they may be facing. It's a gorgeous day out. I'm going to get out and get me a walk. It's real nice. It's cold, but it's nice. I'll take that. But yeah, with that, see you all later. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, and as always, be decent to each other, if at all possible, and sometimes even when it isn't. Alrighty, see y'all later. Bye. Dig, dig, dig until it gets nasty. Then dig some more. Don't worry, we'll be positively subterranean by the end of all this. Things are not happy in the world of Maelstrom. They are going to get far more unhappy. We're beginning to twig to that. Alrighty. Bye again.